The Turok franchise, it dates all the way back to the 1950s, and while I didn't follow the comic books myself, I loved the Acclaim-published video game series which I first played on my Nintendo 64 back in 1997. Acclaim was not doing well financially at that time, and desperately needed a hit. Having purchased Valiant Comics in 1994, they turned to developer Iguana Entertainment to create a unique FPS experience set in the Turok universe. Long story short, this ambitious title was a massive hit, selling over 1 million copies, boosting sales of the N64, and ultimately spawning various sequels and prequels, one of which we are reviewing today, Turok 3: Shadow of Oblivion. Has Night Dive Studios successfully remastered this 2000 release, or is it a dinosaur in 2024 that looks like a fossil? Let's find out in our full review. Real quick folks, don't let the dinosaurs in traditional games media keep you in the Stone Age. Head over to patreon.com/idreamofindiegames to gain Discord access, exclusive live streams, early ad-free shows, and so much more. Support independent content and bring a voice to the voiceless today. Your community is waiting for you. Night Dive Studios have more than proven themselves when it comes to remastering games of the past while preserving their integrity. Having previously restored classics such as Shadow Man and Doom 64 to name a few, they've also freshened up the previous two entries in the Turok franchise with great success. The work they've done up to this point is honestly a bit mind-blowing when you consider the fact that these games were originally being powered by a console with 4 megs of RAM, or 8 if you were lucky enough to have an expansion pack. Yes, the Turok series was ambitious for its time, but it's also pretty damn hard to go back to now if you wish to experience it on original hardware. The janky frame rates, signature N64 muddy textures, and compressed audio will undoubtedly have players asking themselves how they persevered, as we are now so accustomed to blazing fast performance and cutting-edge visuals in our games. A lot of us just didn't know better at the time, and so we were satisfied, even impressed with what we had. Knowing that Father Time is undefeated, Night Dive have once again waved their magic wand, creating a seemingly impossible restoration of perhaps the most polarizing entry in the Turok franchise from the original trilogy. Gone are the nearly unplayable frame rates of the year 2000, replaced with a blazing fast 120 FPS presented in full 4K resolution. Many of the laughable textures have been reworked as best they can be, polished up like a pair of beaten down shoes. Auto-aiming is now an option, allowing players who are in it for the nostalgia, which let's be real is likely going to be a lot of us, to experience the game in its entirety without much of the aggravation found within the original. Perhaps for some, this will be the first time they ever experienced Turok 3, as the game itself was a bit of a Hail Mary launched towards the end zone near the end of the N64's life cycle. Whatever reason you have for diving back into this lost relic of the past, it's shockingly playable and doesn't feel nearly as out of place in 2023 as one might think. Night Dive have shined a bright light on some of the great level design that was always here, only held back by technology at the time. But no more, Turok 3: Shadow of Oblivion feels great while preserving the look of the original title. I know that sounds insane, but you do truly feel like you're playing the original on some sort of souped-up emulator that's taken steroids. With modern control refinements implemented to boot, this is a really well-done remaster. If you haven't played the first 2 Turok games, I'd highly advise doing so before diving into 3, as the story takes place directly after Turok 2: Seeds of Evil. This time you'll have 2 characters to choose between, Joseph and Daniel Fireseed, as opposed to Joshua. They're on a quest to defeat the Oblivion. Am I okay to spoil a game from 2000? I'd better play it safe. I've always found these storylines within the Turok games to be fairly entertaining, and that's no different in Shadow of Oblivion. Obviously the cutscenes won't be up to modern standards, and the voice performances, while surprisingly decent, sound like they were recorded in a bathroom stall, but there's nothing here that's worse than a lot of more recently released FPS campaigns, which one could argue makes Turok 3 feel a bit ahead of its time in terms of offering a halfway compelling story that makes you care enough to press forward.
As was their brother before them.
What?
Turok? Us? Adon,
Silence! Your words betray your weakness. The sons of stone have failed. A new course must be set. Yes, a new course.
Don't confuse my words, there is no literary brilliance here at all, but the narrative is also not as laughably bad as I envisioned it in my mind. As I alluded to earlier, there are two characters to select between, and they both play pretty differently from one another. Sure, it may have been a device to add replay value in the end, but I love that the option even existed in a now nearly 24-year-old game. Danielle has a few more weapons at her disposal, along with gadgets like a grappling hook, and Joshua takes a bit more of a stealthy approach with tools of his own. There are certain areas only accessible depending on which character you use. Factoring everything, Turok 3's campaign is worth going through twice. It's a bit of a shame that co-op was ultimately never implemented, as the developers had a golden opportunity by already having these two unique characters. My understanding is that co-op was originally intended, but budgets and time ended up leading to its cancellation. Turok 3 does take a bit more of a linear approach when compared to the previous two entries as well. While it's possible to miss a switch here or there, or bumble around the surprisingly open areas a bit at times, for the most part I never found myself all that lost, nor needing any sort of map or navigation system. This was a little bit of a shock to me given the age of the game. I remember loving Turok 3 as a 15-year-old teen, but as I stated earlier, Father Time isn't always so kind in the world of video games. We have also seen campaigns in the last many years featuring insane cinematics in real time, and yet Turok 3 was doing it over 2 decades ago. Planes soar by in real time, massive explosions, and impressive enemy AI for the time make Turok 3 feel like an action movie brought to life. Obviously, the visual effects aren't quite as convincing when compared to modern standards, but Night Dive Studios have poured a lot of love into this remaster with some brilliant new lighting and graphical effects. Where their work really shines, however, is in the ways they tightened up the gameplay. Turok 3 feels nearly as good as a modern FPS release, with precise controls now implemented that simply weren't possible before. The engine blazes along beautifully, and with Turok 3 being more of a run and gun experience as opposed to an aim down the sights affair, the original gameplay has transitioned relatively seamlessly into modern times. Even playing on a controller, a cardinal sin for most PC players, was an absolute joy. One of my favorite aspects of the Turok games were the amount of different weapons you could use, and that's no different in Turok 3. It's a game that features over 20 different weapon types that are an absolute blast to use. From the cerebral bore, which can suck out your enemy's brains, to a grenade launcher, or even the fire swarm to set enemies ablaze. The weapons available give the game a little bit of an arcade feel, and it's always been a strength of the series. And you know, for as much as there is to love and celebrate with this remaster, it is still ultimately a very old game with a fresh coat of paint. Even with all the freshening up in the world, retro games simply aren't going to appeal to everyone. One might say, this is nice and all, but I can just go back to my Call of Duty, or whatever other modern FPS is popular these days. I don't really keep up anymore. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of what Night Dive Studios does and what they've done here, but it's not going to peel more modern FPS fans away from their Call of Duty deathmatches. Absolutely not. On the topic of deathmatch, perhaps the biggest disappointment with this remastering of Turok 3 is the lack of multiplayer, because that was a big component of the original release. I have very specific fond memories of playing 4-player split screen, but at the time of this review, the mode is a complete no-show in this remaster. This is a massive shame, as I feel like there was still a great deal of fun to be had here, especially when you consider all of the cool weapons Turok 3 offers. I hope that Night Dive adds this feature soon, making this section of my review age like milk, but that's not a guarantee. Outside of the lack of multiplayer, I only encountered one glitch where my character was hung up in thin air and I couldn't progress, but a simple reload of my last checkpoint was able to undo that. I didn't have any other hard crashes or glitches in my time with the game. So all told, Night Dive Studios have done a brilliant job restoring a game that perhaps not many of you ever got to experience. For those of you who grew up with an N64 and love gaming history, you'll find a lot to like here. For me, this was a really enjoyable trip down memory lane, and Turok 3 Shadow of Oblivion still stands out as a unique piece of gaming history. The graphics and controls have been modernized in a way that makes it playable all these years later, and that should be celebrated. Let's hope multiplayer gets added down the road, but if not, I still recommend checking this one out if you love retro games and you love the idea of preserving games and preserving their past, their history, so on and so on. I am awarding Turok 3 Shadow of Oblivion the Silver Genie Lamp of approval.